educational structure isn't an accident. Though it may seem relatively unimportant to the everyday lives of students and teachers, the divisions of power, decision-making, and responsibilities in our system are keenly tied to ongoing and highly relevant social, political, and financial issues. Throughout its storied history, the organization of Canadian education has reflected some of the most fundamental values of its citizens. Depending on the time period, education has been structured in order to enforce linguistic, religious, and cultural assimilation, to instill a sense of national identity, and, more recently, to celebrate and protect diversity. Competing interest groups, whether they are economic, political, or linguistic, have, and continue to, target education as a medium for forwarding their agendas. The bottom line in this debate is to modify, in either a major or minor way, the state of education at the classroom level through large-scale reforms. By viewing educational structure in a number of lenses, including its history, components, and contemporary purposes and issues, we can paint a picture of how it can be utilized and manipulated to affect teachers and students every day. From its inception, Canadian education has been a space for conflict between larger ideological and ethnic parties. Throughout the early to mid-19th century, a time when all of Canada was looking to establish an identity, the level of centralized control over schooling generated conflict between French Catholic and Protestant English people. Broadly speaking, Upper and Lower Canada. From the perspective of the French, who had previously operated relatively autonomous schools, the government's attempts at formal education, organization, and curriculum mandates were seen as a danger to their cultural stability, especially given their English political alignment. In response, and in keeping with many reform policies of the time, they pushed for local supervision, electoral responsibility, and the general decentralization of their schools. In response, especially to the rebellions around 1841, the conservative federal government pushed for centralization in order to instill a sense of national values, culture, and loyalty. Believing instead in the technical competence and worth of officials, they decried the local ignorance of minority populations they believed to be disloyal to the British authority and, worse yet, aligned with American interests. The reaction to the division within the country culminated within the unification in 1841 and in education with Egerton-Ryerson 1846 Common School Bill. This legislation, which contained several significant reforms, notably included the expansion of the role of superintendents and otherwise strengthened central control of school structure. Even after the 1850 Schools Act, which enhanced some aspects of electoral and local control, the landscape of Canadian education remained mainly standardized and bent as much as possible towards assimilation. This mission notably included the disastrous residential school program from 1876 into the late 20th century. Here, and in related federal programs starting in the 1950s, linguistic, cultural, and religious aspects of the Aboriginal peoples were systematically suppressed. As diversity in population and interest grew in the 20th century, educational structures have since become standardized into their modern forms. Legislative reforms, notably the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in 1982, have mandated a more equitable form of treatment to students, an order conveyed in substantial part by structural enhancements. The debate surrounding education, however, has not slowed since the erosion of its racist and explicitly assimilatory aspects. By examining our contemporary bureaucracy, we can find persistent tensions inspired by ongoing political and ideological disagreements. Despite an overall shift in the purpose of education towards an inclusive program, the practical and financial details of this implementation are sources of controversy. Unlike other industrial countries, the vast majority of educational responsibility and legislation take place at the provincial and not federal level. An overwhelming 93% of students in schools operate under provincially managed and funded schools, with the other 7% spread between federally funded programs, such as reserve and military schools. Each province is headed by an elected Minister of Education who takes control of the professional bureaucracy of his or her Ministry of Education. Because the minister is elected to office and, through an order of the Premier, appointed to the education portfolio, he or she will likely possess a political agenda. As well, since the Minister of Education sits on the Premier's cabinet, they will have a hand in, and be influenced by, overarching and powerful political initiatives that confront their party. This political leaning of educational control has been a source of tension when it meets the professional staffers and bureaucrats of the ministry, represented often by the Deputy Minister and school systems. One way in which to view this tension is the struggle between the centralized partisan leanings of the government and the more locally minded professional staff who seek to protect the flexibility of individual districts and schools. This conflict has become apparent in recent back-to-basics and drill-and-kill attitudes that have come in response to an apparent slide in student test scores. While some political corners have argued for a systematized approach in teaching all students in the same way to achieve reliable results, the educational community has remained reticent, often believing that teacher freedom results in better learning or that the tests used themselves are flawed. Under the provincial ministry, education is divided into school districts and their boards, supervisory and policy-making bodies composed of a board of elected trustees and a superintendent, who is appointed by that board. The tension we examined before reappears at this level as superintendents and principals find themselves at odds with the political and re-election concerns of their trustees, and, in addition, further political, local, and ideological interest groups enter the fray at this level. These groups, which include cultural and linguistic protection groups and parents' associations, have joined the dialogue in school organization in order to enhance, according to their agendas, the experiences of students. We can take a look at a basic organization chart here. Though the conflicts I've highlighted here do not represent critical obstacles, they do show that even though the bureaucratic organization may seem static, its finer operations and methods are under constant scrutiny by a number of parties. How education is structured in government is always in flux as its members interact with each other and as new interest groups attempt to gain a foothold. Rather than a tool for the assimilation of minority groups, the education system we have looked at has been adapted instead to protect diversity and to provide appropriate resources and facilities to those that require them. Though there are disagreements, sometimes significant ones, on how to implement them, these mandates have become fundamental to the purpose and design of the education system. School districts are mandated by the Charter of Rights and Freedoms to provide French instruction and French immersion classes. Reacting against Canada's history of linguistic assimilation, French, along with Aboriginal languages in some contexts, are protected through structural support of their instruction. In addition to this, Aboriginal interest groups since the 1970s, notably in the case of the National Indian Brotherhood, have lobbied quite successfully for autonomy in hiring staff, organizing facilities, and setting educational priorities in schools with Aboriginal students. Unfortunately, these protections have not been extended to minority languages that lack the constitutional force of French and English. Despite this, however, current movements that include new literacy and social justice groups have forwarded a sensitivity towards language diversity. This has included provisions for multilingual writing, non-standard grammar instruction classes, and ELL training for mainstream teachers. And, through curricula, ministries of education have structurally mandated cross-cultural and historical learning that express the value of marginalized or vulnerable groups rather than denigrate them. More than ever, the multicultural stance taken by the Canadian government in the 1980s is being recognized. These new programs, facilities, and provisions all represent explicit shifts in Canadian values in a very short amount of time. A tangible example of this trend and the tensions that surround it are highlighted by the current push in Winnipeg to establish an Indigenous school division. As seen in these two CBC News articles, many parents and Aboriginal rights groups are now attempting to reorganize 29 Winnipeg schools into a new Indigenous school division. Referencing ongoing socioeconomic and cultural destabilization, as well as Canada's spotty history when it comes to Aboriginal education, this interest group wishes for sweeping reform. The proposed plan would maintain the current Manitoba curriculum, but feature a focus on Indigenous culture, traditions, and history. Though students of all backgrounds would be welcome, the proposed plan has been criticized as a form of cultural favoritism and even segregation. The response, however, has been that the structures of schooling have thus far failed the Aboriginal community, as dropout rates, health problems, experiences of crime, and social issues have escalated. Additionally, in this CBC article, the controversy surrounding the degree of religious education in schools is investigated. The article states that in 2012 an appeal to the Supreme Court by parents had been dismissed. The subject of their grievance was a curriculum change by the Quebec Ministry of Education that replaced specific religion courses with a comparative program that covered all faiths, including Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. Parents argued that the course, which is offered in elementary school, would infringe on their children's freedom of religion and pose harm via an encounter with quote-unquote incompatible beliefs. This subject appears to be in keeping with the modern multicultural stance of Canada's educational ministries that was elaborated on earlier. Similarly, the finer details and implementation, that is, how far educational structures like curriculum interpretation and enactment should go, are the subjects of heated debate. Controversy has always, and likely will always, be a factor in education. As we've seen, interest groups of all stripes will target education to forward their agendas. The endgame has been to influence the macro-structural aspects of education so as to affect students in their everyday lives. In turn, the hope is nothing less than to alter Canadian society. Though the structure of education may seem static, even tedious, it is a potent social restructuring tool. So, despite the fact that education has thankfully turned towards a more inclusive policy, it falls on the Canadian people to defend and progress this. With what we know, consider the following questions. Would you support the creation of an Indigenous school division in Winnipeg? Why or why not? Would you agree with the long-lived idea that public electoral control of education is perilous because of the local ignorance of voters? Why or why not? What role should government-created curriculum play in teaching civics, citizenship, and Canadian values in all classrooms?
All the rowboats in